So, welcome back everyone. We hope you've had a wonderful breakfast, lunch, or dinner, or small snack, or maybe just had some water. Welcome to our segment on integration. My name is Daan Keijman. I've been involved with the Open Foundation for over a decade now, and I'm also the Director of Ethics and Advocacy at Synthesis Retreats, where I'm also a lead facilitator, guiding people through psychedelic experiences and offering them both preparation and integration support. So it's with great joy that I can moderate this panel right now. And we have two great speakers lined up for you. They will share their perspectives, offer insights, and show some of the empirical data from their research on the fascinating topic of integration. As Professor Toffoli will discuss in his talk, although integration seems to be the latest buzzword in the psychedelic sphere, there's actually very little research into what integration actually is and how it is conceptualized and how it is practiced. Many practitioners consider integration of paramount value and importance to both the therapeutic efficacy of psychedelic experiences, but also in the mitigation of potential negative impacts or consequences of a challenging psychedelic experience. Yet the scientific consensus on what aspects of integration actually work and why it works is still lacking. Moreover, integration in Europe and North America seems to be primarily conceptualized and practiced in a highly individualized manner. Whereas Professor Toffoli will share more critical perspectives, especially from drawing on anthropological fieldwork with ayahuasca communities in Brazil, where integration might play a less central role or is more communal or is absent altogether or completely different understood. Henry Whitfield will offer insights into the way in which the acceptance and commitment therapy model can function as a powerful modality in the integration process. So without further ado, let's jump in and introduce our first speaker. Luis Fernando Toffoli is a professor of psychiatry at the Faculty of Medical Sciences of the University of Campinas in Brazil. He leads the Laboratory of Interdisciplinary Studies on Psychoactive Substances and is a member of the State Council on Drug Policies of São Paulo. He is also responsible for the Interdisciplinary Corporation for Ayahuasca Research and Outreach, also at the University of Campinas. And he has been published in the fields of drug policies and the therapeutic use of psychedelics with a very strong focus on ayahuasca. Professor Toffoli will offer us a critical examination of the concept of integration and explores how we can think about integration by discussing some key concepts from psychological medicine and medical anthropology, and by drawing on examples from ayahuasca religions in Brazil. So please take it away.
Thank you very much, Dan, for this presentation. Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen, and while I do that, I'd like to say that it's a pleasure to be here. Can you see my screen right now, I suppose?
Yes,
yeah, is
perfect.
That okay? Okay, thank you. I want to thank Open for the opportunity and for such a diverse and exciting conference. It's not very common to see such richness and variety of perspectives as we see in this conference. So this work is about psychedelic integration. And it's an ongoing project that is taking the shape of an academic paper that I wish to publish in collaboration with anthropologist Emilia Sanabria. Let us start with the meaning of psychedelic integration. The current mainstream definition of integration among psychedelic enthusiasts and researchers describes it as a set of techniques and procedures that are used to offer people who have taken psychedelics the possibility of assimilating these experiences in a useful way in their lives. I have done a quick and general internet search on the different types of integration processes for psychedelic experiences. The result was a vast gamut or options that include the following: psychotherapy, whether individual or group therapy, counseling, or coaching, debriefing or sharing about how the peak experience was, having the psychedelic experience written down, undergoing somatic treatments, meditating, especially when using mindfulness techniques, performing breath work, a practice that may require posterior integration by itself, paying attention to the body and taking measures of self-care, searching a community for integration purposes, artistic activities, for instance, writing, painting, or drawing, especially drawing mandalas, reading, the contemplation of nature, and, believe it or not, house cleaning. Throughout meetings and publications that discuss the current use of psychedelics, it seems that integration became a part of this subculture as a mandatory item of what could be understood as a safe and meaningful psychedelic healing experience. However, it is relevant to note that contemporary integration might be something a little different from what was initially thought with this name. When academic studies with LSD and other psychedelics in the 1960s or the 70s mentioned integration, it applied to a necessary step to consolidate the therapeutic power of these substances. As far as I could find, there is no clear and undisputable genealogy of the origin of this concept. No psychedelic researcher that proposed integration has pinpointed where this notion came from, or try to theorize it at a deeper level. It seems that based on empirical observations and experience, people who gave psychedelics to patients observed that consolidating peak experiences was healthier. That was particularly the case of researchers and clinicians that preferred psychedelic therapy to the psycholytic approach. Understandably, very sudden and intense experiences of that kind would require a period of support and reconnection to regular life. When one reads the pioneers of psychedelic research, what the pioneers of psychedelic research wrote about this process, the term integration was commonly presented together with other psychoanalytical terms, such as the unconscious, transference, and abreaction. So the concept seemed to be closer to the idea of ego integration. Ego integration would be part of the consolidating of personality. And it was popular among the leading psychoanalysts of the period, such as Winnicott or Kernberg. Interestingly, as psychoanalytic terms slowly disappeared from the psychedelic literature, the concept of integration remained and found its way into contemporary psychedelic popular culture at a time when transference is discussed only among the psychedelic supporters of psychoanalysis. But there is more to this story. As early as the 1940s, Jung brought the idea that unconscious elements and transcendent experiences are part of what one needs to incorporate into personality in a process named as individuation. Other approaches that seem to have contributed to the current concept of psychedelic integration were Gestalt therapy and transpersonal psychology. Both theories present constructs that convey the idea of integrating the different parts of the self into a whole. Among those theories, Jungian and transpersonal psychology were the ones that accepted with more ease the idea that integration was also a process for the assimilation of mystical experiences and spiritual dimensions into the structure of personality. Because of that, it is no surprise that they are closer to the current idea of integration that prevails in the psychedelic subculture. Another important point about integration is the fact that when past and current psychedelic researchers invoke the need for it, they are usually talking about therapeutic trials. In this case, we are dealing with individuals who were being treated for mental illnesses. Research protocols traditionally have dealt with the need for providing holding for these subjects by using different psychotherapeutic techniques, such as therapy sessions, diaries, art therapy, to name a few. Although they were not homogeneous, when examining these protocols, it is clear that there is no such multiplicity of integration recommendations compared to what we find in the internet. Moreover, under a strict empirical approach to psychedelic science, integration lacks a lot of evidence. Many dilemmas need solutions, such as, Which procedure works best for which disorder and person? Is there any specificity for all integration practices? Are they equally efficient? To what extent and which situations is integration really necessary? How many cases of integrated or non-integrated psychedelic experiences will lead to undesirable aftermaths? And perhaps more importantly, how much of the therapeutic results could be attributed to the integration itself rather than to the psychedelic experience? However, in the contemporary times of the psychedelic hype, integration became so popular that it is also a product now. Internet sites offer integration circles, integration coaches, integration courses, and so on. An issue that was exclusively used in treatment terms is increasingly becoming a must-do for anyone who is supposed to try a psychedelic with self-fulfilling purposes. And when someone mentions that in traditional entheogenic settings, there seems to be no such thing as a formal integration process, a common answer states that in native settings, cosmology would be in favor of those who take psychedelics. The entire set of traditional beliefs would provide a seamless transition from the individual perspective to collective understanding, and then encompass the peak experience without much ado. Non-Westerners would then have some sort of immunity to the need of integration. But does this apply to all ritual uses of ayahuasca, for example? In South American settings outside Brazil, ayahuasca is mostly used by Westerners as a treatment where peak experiences are intensely endured. On the other hand, when attending the rituals of the Brazilian ayahuasca religions, the perspective of integration is not a rule. There are, depending on the tradition, informal discussions about what was felt or happened during an ayahuasca experience. Some of the more recent neo-shamanic groups have even incorporated formal debriefing and integration techniques after the psychedelic effects fade away. Still, in other perspectives, one is supposed to avoid describing their visions or their experiences. But apart from these more recent developments, I'm talking about non-indigenous individuals that are Western oriented and do not practice a distinct and structured procedure to integrate their experiences. It is also important to remember that this setting is more or less the same in Brazil, the United States of America, parts of Europe, and elsewhere Santo Daime or UDV members congregate. Although there are religious principles and rules, this is quite different from being part of an indigenous society and sharing an indigenous cosmology. One must then reflect whether the excuse for not having a formal integration procedure comes from a perspective that tends to segregate the so-called Westerners from other cultures. As I approach the end of this presentation, I think it's time to ask some provocative questions, since I would not like to come up with ready-made or all-encompassing proposals for the issue of psychedelic integration. I think this is something that we really need to discuss a lot. So, to what extent are we still living under the aegis of mind colonialism when we say that the native use of entheogens dispenses with integration procedures just because Western techniques are not used? Are we looking only at our own comfort as individuals and forgetting that, after all, integrating is not only about connecting with oneself or with safe communities that share the same values, but it also concerns integrating society as a whole? How has this issue been transformed from something desirable and recommendable, which is to give and receive support after an intense experience, to a set of rules and prescriptions intrinsically linked to the capitalist way of life, a way that is destroying this planet? To remind us of that, while our forests burn under the custody of Jair Bolsonaro, I close with the words of Ailton Krenak, a Brazilian indigenous thinker. The type of zombie humankind that we are being asked to integrate does not tolerate so much pleasure, so much enjoyment. So they anticipate the end of the world to make us give up our dreams. And my provocation about postponing the end of the world is precisely about always being able to tell one more story. So I hope you have enjoyed the story I told you today, and thank you for your attention.
Muito obrigado. That was wonderful and very provoking questions indeed. We will have a lot of opportunity to go in depth in the breakout rooms after this segment. And we will also have space for a Q&A straight after Henry's talk. So I would like to introduce Henry Whitfield. Henry is an ACBS peer-reviewed ACT trainer for the Association of Contextual Behavioral Science. He is an accredited advanced trainer in TIR, therapy for PTSD, and he is a cognitive behavioral psychotherapist. For over 7 years, Henry ran and supervised brief therapy for PTSD projects for victim support and the mental health charity Mind in London. He has also conducted research comparing trauma approaches for mind and single case design research at Regans University, where he examined how acceptance and commitment therapy processes might mediate therapeutic outcomes of psychedelic journeys. He is a passionate integral thinker, published journal articles, and book chapters on the integration of therapeutic models, and he has written, co-written, and edited training manuals for 3 different therapeutic modalities. He now focuses his research on the development of ACT-consistent models for psychedelic integration with psychedelic process research for Regans University in London. And in today's presentation, Henry will present his longitudinal multiple baseline investigation of psychedelic integration using ACT, and he will share both some quantitative and qualitative data. Henry, please take it away.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Great. Let me just share my screen first of all. So hopefully this works. Great. So thank you so much, Dan and Lewis, for that great introduction to what is integration, something that's debated so much. So yeah, let me just start by, thank you so much, Open, for having us. And what I'm going to be presenting is a study done with Regents University, Regents School of Psychotherapy and Psychology, where we are going to be looking at some longitudinal data of how integration has unfolded for about 27 participants. So let me start with, I'd really like to acknowledge there's so many people who've helped make this happen. I'm just really so grateful to so many people, especially Brandon Samper and Stephen Hayes, who enabled a whole new branch of the study, which is this GIME analysis that we're going to be looking at soon. But
Henry, sorry to interrupt you. You're sharing your screen, but we see a Word document. So maybe we're seeing the other screen or another presentation.
Oh, thank you. Hang on, let me see if I can sort that out. I'm not sure how that happened. Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, perfect.
So just a little bit of context. Many psychedelic integration practices have been highlighted to be non-case specific. Sloshar and his colleagues really have pointed out how often it's a non-specific mixture of things like supportive listening and encouragement, meditation, journaling. So a big thrust of this project is to try and understand how can we interweave modern psychotherapeutic methods, things like contextual behavioral science, with a psychedelic experience. How can we have an operational relationship with the problem being treated during a whole psychedelic therapy? Although of course today I'll be looking at the integration phase mainly. So just to tell you a little bit about the research study that how it all started. we at Mindfulness Training Limited is a training company I've been running for a long time. We've been running retreats in the Netherlands. So far we've had 3 retreats, mainly aimed at mental health professionals who we think we're hoping might be especially insightful about the psychotherapeutic psychedelic process when we interview them. So the next thing I'm going to look at is also how we interweave these 2 worlds. How do we interweave ACT with what is the psychedelic experience? So let's see what's happening next. Oh dear, I don't know why I'm struggling to scroll through my slides here, but let me see if this will work. So sorry about this. Okay, adapting a model. All right, so self-perspective taking is something in contextual behavioral science that's been highlighted as a behavioral way of understanding perhaps what even transcendence is how I might sum it up. So jumping to a model that responds, that could hopefully be adequate to the extremes of the psychedelic experience. There's a lot in psychedelic literature, such as the emotional breakthrough inventory, that points out how things like trauma can be really important to face trauma. At the other end of the scale, we have the mystical experience, where the whole notion of self can be dissolving away. So what we have here is a whole continuum of selves. It's also integrating into internal family systems therapy. ACT is very much, rather than just being one fixed therapy, ACT is all about flexibility. So it's very much about interweaving whatever can serve ACT processes, such as being able to step back from thoughts and not see thoughts, or when we hear voices in our heads, how can we have a different relationship with those? And internal family systems is an excellent way of expanding that. And we've been looking at, in ACT for a very long time, looking at different voices in our heads and how we relate to them. So we have this whole another big aspect that we look at in behavioral science side is how a self is like, it can be a container. A perspective is a container of maybe other perspectives. So here what we're doing is moving up through all these, through a whole spectrum of cells, which are very much like Russian dolls. So for the sake of time, I think I'd better move on. There's one other aspect to the model that we've been developing and trying out. So what we're looking at here is, it's very much influenced by the work of Françoise Borzat's consciousness medicine, where we look at the different levels in these different sections of life, of how we experience life, such as self-care, relationships, community, environment, and how we can look from a behavioral science point of view. We can look at how different behaviors in these different domains serve us or don't serve us. A big part of what we do in ACT therapy is looking at how we need to bring barriers into the work. Of course, as during a psychedelic integration process, at a certain point there are going to be old fears, old thoughts that appear to get in the way. So yeah, this can be applied very flexibly depending on how an individual participant relates to it. So now looking at the data and the daily data that we collected in a bit more detail. The kind of questions that we asked our participants to answer on a daily basis was things like, how open are you to experiencing your emotions? What we're trying to do there is measure psychological flexibility itself on a daily basis. Also, in line with this emphasis on the self and the ability to take perspective on self, we're looking at how asking somebody how their personality might get in the way of making their life better. So we're asking questions like that on a daily basis. Just briefly, I want to show that we can. This study, it's also framed with some normal outcome measures like depression. Even though, remember, we had more healthy normals who were involved in this study, who were the participants in this study. A couple of them were severely depressed, but the group generally was not a depressed sample. And yet, with a depression and anxiety measure, we still had a large effect size of 0.55. So looking at these, the daily data now. So this gives another overview of the study. So we have a baseline here. This purple line represents as the line goes down, it means their sense of their self-content, their self-story is less in the way of them living the life that they want to live. Whereas this line here at the top is a measure of psychological flexibility. And as you can see, very much in line with a lot of people's experience of an afterglow, for a period of often weeks, the person feels much more expanded, much more psychologically flexible. But usually, or perhaps inevitably, that's going to wear off, and the old story, the mind is going to creep back with a story such as, I will never love again. This was one of our participants. Another one, I'm losing my new social self that I gained from the psychedelic retreat. Another one here, what's the point? My friends have moved away, you know, some old thinking patterns reemerge. But then with the point of a multi-baseline study is that we can see that when we add an ACT intervention, you can see that the psychological flexibility increases. Again, so it seems like we are rehabilitating or bringing back the psychological flexibility that was there just after the retreat. So in the next cohort, we have done 3 cohorts altogether, but just looking at 2 of them. And this was the last cohort that we did. We added 2 more questions, looking at life satisfaction. In general, how satisfied are you with your life? It's a question you're answering every day. And also, how often did you experience negative emotions today? So what I've jumped to here now, before we look at more graphs like that, I wanted to just show you some of the qualitative data. Some of this qualitative data I've just been looking at over the last week. And so this is what's giving us a sense on the qualitative data, how the integration therapy and the psychedelic experience actually interweave. So everybody was asked systematically what their experience of the integration therapy was and how it may be intertwined with the psychedelic experience. So one thing that stood out a lot was how it seemed a bit like the psychedelic experience can turbocharge the therapy, because of course they leave with this, they're much more opened up, perhaps more willing to experience difficult feelings. And then, so we have quotes like this one, such as, during the psychedelic experience, I was just crying. And I was like, where are all these tears coming from? And then in the therapy session, the same thing. I just felt these waves of emotion coming over me. I remember I being in the retreat as well, having witnessed that during the retreat and seeing the same thing continue weeks after the actual psychedelic experience had happened. We've already talked about the afterglow seems to be extendable. So now going back to perspective taking in this model over here. So perspective switching is kind of a term I'm using for a kind of experiential exercise of jumping between different perspectives of self. So a person comes up with a specific barrier like, oh, I'm broken, you know, I'm a critical thought. So you ask them to imagine that thought on purpose, and then an alternative thought that would be a more compassionate, expanded viewpoint. And people found that very, very helpful. Often they found it much easier to just remain in a more compassionate viewpoint. The past work from the IFS was people just raved about how helpful that was and how that deepened their experience. It was very helpful to go deeper with that. One person says, tremendously helpful for me to not be so much in the grip of these parts. It just gives me more choice. Another example, this was my favorite example perhaps, was the using of therapy and psychedelics interweaving during the integration phase. What one person said was, what I learned was that there was a way to re-experience the trip in such a way that it's available to me every day. So this is a very powerful effect. I really felt the emotions that were related to this. They weren't as strong, but they went in that direction. So this was very, very useful. And another participant, it kind of felt like I was back there again, and I got the real kind of afterglow feeling for the rest of the evening. So yeah, that's a really nice example of this kind of two-way street between psychedelics and psychotherapy and how they can feed into each other. So then yeah, I've got lots of good feedback on being able to track someone's changing behavior in these multiple levels. One very simple aspect of this kind of diagram is that it can point out holes. You know, very often people have neglected community, and that becomes very clear when you look at it in that way. So just briefly now, here we have another, this is where we're measuring satisfaction and psychological flexibility. And using this is with the help of Brandon Sanford that I mentioned earlier, it's possible to track and statistically analyze relationships between all these different lines, all these different elements. So we've got psychological flexibility, we've got personality getting in the way, we've got satisfaction. And then we can even relate these to each other, so we can see patterns across the whole group. So that here in this cohort, we had 7 people who provided enough data. You need like 7 data points for each and that's around 60 data points for each participant. And one thing that we found in all 7 of those participants was a progression of when a person progressed towards what mattered to them, that would increase how they acted with awareness generally, which would increase their openness, and that openness would usually increase satisfaction. I am kind of running out of time here, so I can't tell you a lot more about this, but yeah, I mean, this dotted line is when one predicts things with a lag of a day. So we can look at how there can be some form of causal relationship between these different parts. So that kind of brings me pretty much to the end. Just briefly, some preliminary conclusions, of course, is that it does seem to be possible to extend the afterglow kind of effects. A person can be in a way, it seems like we can regress them back into the psychedelic experience so that they can access the expanded psychedelic perspectives again, that can then be fed back into the therapy. Self-perspective taking, whether it was with IFS or direct perspective switching, was very, very helpful for deepening and extending their integration. The measures, yeah, I didn't have time to tell you about the measures that didn't work so well, but the ones that we did use there were really helpful. Perhaps a next step might be to apply this to a more clinical population. But I guess my final takeaway thought is that interweaving a therapy, an appropriate therapy with psilocybin does seem to potentially give more than the sum of their parts. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry, for your wonderful presentation. And I think this goes for all the speakers. It's really a challenge to condense the amazing amount of research and evidence and insights that you would like to share into a very short time segment. So thank you for being so succinct. Actually, I would love to start with you. There's a couple of questions from the audience. Henry, there's a question from Michiel van den Oever, who asks, the part where you displayed the graphs about the psychological flexibility, they were very interesting. And he wonders how you account for all the things that are happening in the life of your patients. So you described the effect, for example, of an ACT intervention, but how can you be sure that no other factors had also an effect during that period? For example, being in a nice neighborhood or having an encounter with a neighbor. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. Basically, what we did was we did try to follow that data. In every therapy session, we would ask them, as things had shifted, what happened on Tuesday when your psychological flexibility dropped like this or went up like that? And we would get information about other external factors, and that could be interwoven into the therapy. Also, the last cohort was the COVID cohort. So we do have data on what was happening for that. So as we continue our analysis, we can attempt to take that into consideration.
Thank you very much. Louis, there's also a question for you. Looking it up. You were talking about the absence of integration practices within indigenous communities. And the question is if you think this could be because entheogenic use is integrated in their larger culture, i.e. their experiences are already integrated in a larger cultural framework or an indigenous worldview. Could you speak to that?
So this is basically the argument that I presented at first. So I would not deny that. I think this is possible, but also we have to think that ayahuasca use is different from among all the indigenous groups that use ayahuasca. We have different uses of it. So in some kinds, people drink ayahuasca once in their lives. In other cases, they drink a lot of times. It's very different. Obviously, you have something that is imprinted in their cosmology, as I said. But the thing is, it's not only the case of native users of ayahuasca who take ayahuasca and don't do a formal way of integration. I'm not saying that it's not interesting. I'm not saying that it's not important. I'm just saying that it's possible to have a psychedelic experience with ayahuasca and not having a formal integration process. We made a community forum about this issue before I want to hear or to listen or to read, in fact, what people would like to know about integration before we started the session. And there is one quote by Paloma David, who said that in Colombia, there is one interesting saying that some curanderos use about ayahuasca, in this case, yaje. They say that 50% of the work is done by yaje, by ayahuasca, and the other 50% it's on you. You have to do it. So the way that you're going to do this work, then it's open. And my point here is that at least we should argue the idea that you have to do something mandatory, and not that you have to find your own way and to integrate the experience. And also remember to think in a more collective, in a more social, in terms of the whole society when you're thinking about integration experiences with psychedelics. That's my point here.
Thank you. And it's lovely to hear that actually, maybe in a more implicit way, Henry is also referring to the impact of these things outside our individual lives that deeply impact how the integration process kind of takes form and shape. And what I hear you argue is a sort of shift, if I'm correct, from the I to the we, a much more collective orientation in working with psychedelics. Henry, can you speak to the ways in which ACT models or ACT-based models kind of address the relational or social aspects of the integration process?
Yeah, very much so. In that, with that diagram I was showing with relationships, community, there are already contextual behavioral science interventions for relational issues and group functioning issues. So all this can interweave into that and could serve how we can function better as groups. But yeah, I very much believe that's extremely important. Sort of everything is relational. We're all in relationship with many things, and we're all one in a way. So it's kind of about responding to that in a CBS informed way, which is possible.
We're slowly coming to the end of our time together, but I've one more question, Professor Toffoli. Do you perceive of ways in which we could overcome this sort of neo-colonialist, more problematic split between the sort of global north and global south understandings of integration? Or would you argue more in favor of a sort of pluralistic understanding of integration, where we just have these different approaches that might never meet and might be suitable for people in different cultural or environmental contexts?
I would answer this question, which is a very good question, in two ways. First, in the very square perspective of science, we need work like Henry is doing. We need to know which is the specific, how does it operate, how does it work. We need the inputs of science on that. So I'm not being anti-science in any sense. But also, I think that we have to understand that there are ways that our world works, that how it operates. And we have to be aware of how things are going, because on that depends the survival of humanity. We're talking about global warming. And this has to do with the picture that's behind me right now. So there's no thing as science that it's outside politics. We have to all the time think about it. And when we're talking about the relationship of psychedelics, politics is also involved. And in a sense, answering this question, the first part of the question, as how to solve this problem, this is not a problem of psychedelics, this is not a problem of ayahuasca, this is a problem of the world, how it operates. So I'm not a specialist on geopolitics, but I would favor that for now, within what we can do in the field and discussing and having our conversations, is to favor a more pluralistic way of looking at it, and trying to positively contaminate each part of the world with the worldviews of the other part. And this is rather non-colonial. So people from the global south have a lot to teach, and this works both ways. So let's integrate. That's the idea. Integrated knowledges as well.
Thank you so much for bringing this very important perspective into this conversation. It is truly invaluable. We really need to start wrapping up, but I would love to check in with you, Henry, if there's any last thoughts or insights you would like to share. And then there's plenty of other questions going on in the Q&A. There will be multi-room breakout rooms, so be sure to go there if you want to really get some time with Henry or Professor Toffoli. Henry, last word?
One last thing I might drop in is just that I completely agree with what Luis was saying just there, and there is a movement called pro-social, which is applying behavioral science for dealing with even political problems like that, and also contextual behavioral science is very much about having a local workability agenda, and not looking for one universal truth or universal way. It's all about context sensitivity. So I just completely agree.
Thank you so much, both of you, for these last words and this very profoundly important emphasis on the relational and the crises that we're facing as a humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you very much. It's my turn to wrap up. Valeu, Toffoli. It's lovely to see you. Thank you for that last critical note on Bolsonaro. I don't think he can get criticized enough. Thank you very much, Henry.
Thank you.
It's lovely to see so many Brazilians out there. I'm gonna cut this short. I will let you know that there will be a short workout session, so you can get up and start doing some jumps and get your body active as well. Get out of your chair. And following that, we'll have a track on psychedelic treatments for alcoholism using MDMA and psilocybin in this room. And in the other room will be a Chacruna sponsored panel on equality, access, and access in psychedelic medicine. So see you all in a few minutes. Bye again.
Bye-bye.